It was a cold autumn evening when the rain began to fall over the small town of Brookfield. The streets were nearly empty, and the yellow lights from the street lamps reflected on the wet pavement. Inside the local emergency clinic, the night shift had just begun. Most nights were quiet here. A few patients with minor injuries, the occasional fever, sometimes an elderly person needing help. Nothing unusual. But that night, something happened that no one in that clinic would ever forget. Around 9 o'clock, the clinic door slowly opened. A woman stepped inside. She looked exhausted. Her coat was old and worn, her hair messy, and her hands were trembling from the cold. At first glance, she looked like someone who had been living on the streets for a long time. The receptionist barely looked up from her desk. People like that sometimes came in asking for warmth or a cup of water. But this woman didn't ask for help. Instead, she walked slowly toward the waiting area and sat down in silence. A few minutes later, something unexpected happened. One of the nurses noticed the way the woman was watching the emergency room doors, not with curiosity, not with fear, but with the calm, focused look of someone who understood exactly what was happening behind those doors. And then the woman quietly whispered something that made the nurse freeze. "I used to work in a place like this." No one believed her at first. After all, she looked like just another homeless woman. But within the next hour, something would happen that would leave the entire clinic in complete shock, because the woman sitting quietly in that waiting room was not who anyone thought she was, and the truth about her past would change everything. Inside the clinic, the night shift continued as usual. Machines hummed quietly, nurses walked through the corridors, and the faint smell of antiseptic filled the air. For most of the staff, it seemed like just another ordinary evening. But in the emergency room, Dr. Daniel Harris was finishing paperwork after a long day. Dr. Harris had worked in Brookfield for almost 12 years. People in town trusted him completely. He was known as a calm and patient doctor, the kind of person who never refused help, even when his shift had already ended. But that night, he was exhausted. It had already been a difficult week, 2 serious accidents, several emergency surgeries, and very little sleep. All he wanted now was to finish his reports and finally go home. Outside the emergency room, the nurses were discussing the quiet night. "It's strange," one of them said quietly. "Usually, Fridays are much busier." Another nurse shrugged. "Maybe we'll finally have a peaceful shift for once." But at that moment, something unusual was already beginning to unfold in the waiting room. The woman who had entered the clinic earlier was still sitting in the same chair. She hadn't moved. Her eyes carefully followed every sound coming from the emergency room corridor. The beeping of monitors, the hurried footsteps of nurses, the distant voice of a doctor giving instructions. She seemed to recognize every sound, as if she had heard them 1,000 times before. After a while, the receptionist began to feel uncomfortable. The woman had been sitting there for almost 30 minutes without saying a word. Finally, the receptionist walked over to her. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" she asked politely. For a moment, the woman didn't answer. Then she slowly looked up. Her eyes were tired, but there was something surprisingly sharp in them, something that didn't match the image of a helpless homeless person. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "I just needed a place to sit for a while." The receptionist nodded and returned to her desk. But the nurse who had heard the conversation kept watching the woman from a distance. Something about her behavior felt strange. It wasn't just the way she watched the emergency room doors. It was the way she sat, her posture, her calmness. People who lived on the streets usually looked nervous inside hospitals, but this woman looked familiar with the environment. as if she had spent years working in places exactly like this one. The nurse was about to approach her again, when suddenly the loud alarm of a heart monitor echoed through the emergency room. Everything changed in a matter of seconds. The sharp alarm from the heart monitor echoed through the emergency room corridor. Within seconds, the calm atmosphere inside the clinic disappeared. Nurses rushed toward the patient's room, their footsteps quick and urgent. Dr. Harris immediately stood up from his desk. "Room 3!" someone shouted. He grabbed a pair of gloves and hurried down the hallway. Inside the room, a middle-aged man lay on the hospital bed. His chest moved unevenly, and the heart monitor beside him showed chaotic lines. A nurse was already checking his pulse. "Pulse is weak," she said nervously. Another nurse adjusted the oxygen mask, while Dr. Harris quickly began examining the patient. "What happened?" he asked. "He came in 15 minutes ago with severe chest pain," one of the nurses replied. "We suspected a heart attack." The monitor suddenly beeped faster. The patient gasped for air. Dr. Harris frowned. "Prepare the defibrillator," he said calmly, though the tension in the room was obvious. Outside the room, the corridor filled with quiet anxiety. The clinic staff had seen emergencies many times before, but something about this situation felt different. Meanwhile, in the waiting area, the homeless woman slowly lifted her head. She had heard the alarm. Her eyes focused on the emergency room door. The sounds coming from inside were familiar to her, too familiar. Voices calling instructions, the hurried movement of medical equipment, the rhythm of panic that always followed a failing heart. For a moment, she closed her eyes. Memories seemed to flash through her mind. Bright ambulance lights, the sound of sirens, cold winter nights, patients fighting for their lives. Years ago, these sounds had been part of her daily life. She opened her eyes again. The nurse who had been watching her earlier noticed something strange. The woman's expression had changed. She no longer looked tired or lost. Instead, she looked focused, almost professional. Inside the emergency room, the situation was becoming worse. The patient's breathing suddenly stopped. "Cardiac arrest!" a nurse shouted. Dr. Harris immediately began chest compressions. "Start CPR!" he ordered. The defibrillator was brought in quickly. The team worked with urgency. But something wasn't right. The patient's heart rhythm was unstable in a way that confused the staff. "Charge to 200, the nurse said. The machine prepared the shock. "Clear." The patient's body jerked slightly as the electric shock was delivered. Everyone looked at the monitor. For a moment, there was hope. But then the chaotic rhythm returned. "Again," Dr. Harris ordered. Outside the room, the waiting area had grown quiet. The receptionist and two nurses listened nervously to the activity inside the emergency room. And then, the waiting room chair scraped softly against the floor. The homeless woman slowly stood up. The nurse looked at her with surprise. "Ma'am, please remain seated," she said politely. But the woman didn't respond. Instead, she looked directly toward the emergency room doors. Her voice was calm, but firm. "You're shocking the wrong rhythm." The nurse blinked in confusion. "What did you say?" The woman stepped forward slightly. "The patient isn't responding because that isn't ventricular fibrillation," she said. Her tone sounded strangely confident. "Check the monitor again." For a moment, the nurse simply stared at her. This was a homeless woman. Her clothes were old. Her hair was messy. She had walked in from the street, and yet she was speaking like someone who knew exactly what was happening inside that room. The nurse hesitated. Then the emergency room doors suddenly opened. One of the younger nurses rushed out. "We need another IV kit," she said quickly. The homeless woman looked at her. "How long has the patient been without oxygen?" she asked calmly. The nurse froze. "About 3 minutes." The woman nodded slightly. You don't have much time. The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. Everyone looked at her, and in that moment, something became very clear. This woman was not just another homeless stranger. For a moment, no one moved. The nurse who had been speaking with the woman looked uncertain. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," she said quietly. But before she could finish her sentence, another alarm sounded from inside the emergency room. This time it was louder, more urgent. Inside the room, Dr. Harris was still performing chest compressions. The patient's skin had already begun to turn pale. Sweat covered the doctor's forehead as he worked. "How long?" he asked between compressions. "Almost 4 minutes," a nurse answered anxiously. The heart monitor continued to flash unstable lines. Something wasn't right. Dr. Harris felt it too. He had seen hundreds of cardiac emergencies in his career, but this rhythm, this reaction to the shocks, it didn't make sense. "Charge again," he ordered. The defibrillator hummed as it prepared another shock. But just outside the room, the homeless woman suddenly spoke again. "You're losing him." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the hallway with a strange calm authority. The nurse standing beside her frowned. "How would you even know that?" she asked. The woman looked at the emergency room door. "If the rhythm hasn't stabilized after 2 shocks, it's not the rhythm you think it is," she said quietly. The nurse stared at her. "You need to check the lead placement on the monitor," the woman continued, "and listen to his breathing again." Inside the emergency room, Dr. Harris paused for a split second. He had heard voices from the hallway, but he didn't have time to think about it. The patient's pulse was fading. "Clear!" the nurse shouted. The shock was delivered again. The patient's body jumped slightly. Everyone looked at the monitor. For a moment, the lines straightened. Then the chaotic rhythm returned again. The nurse beside the doctor looked worried. "This isn't working." Dr. Harris clenched his jaw. He knew she was right, and time was running out. Outside the room, the homeless woman slowly walked toward the emergency room doors. The nurse tried to stop her. "Ma'am, you can't go in there." But the woman gently pulled her arm away. Her voice remained calm. "If you keep shocking him like that, his heart will stop completely." The nurse hesitated. Something about the woman's tone made it difficult to argue. At that exact moment, the emergency room doors opened again. A nurse rushed out to grab more equipment. Before anyone could react, the homeless woman stepped inside the room. The staff froze for a second. Dr. Harris looked up in confusion. "Who is she?" he demanded. But the woman didn't look at him. Her eyes immediately moved to the heart monitor. She studied the rhythm for only a second. Then she shook her head slightly. "That's not ventricular fibrillation," she said firmly. The room fell silent. One of the nurses looked shocked. "What?" The woman stepped closer to the patient. "That's pulseless electrical activity," she said. "If you keep using the defibrillator, you're wasting time." Dr. Harris stared at her. Every instinct told him this was absurd. A homeless woman had just walked into his emergency room and was correcting his diagnosis. But then he looked back at the monitor, and something inside him hesitated, because what she said suddenly made sense. For several seconds, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the heavy breathing of the medical team. Dr. Harris looked from the monitor to the woman standing beside the patient. Her clothes were worn. Her coat looked as if it had seen years of rain and cold. Yet the way she stood beside the hospital bed, the way she watched the monitor, it didn't look like confusion. It looked like experience. Dr. Harris frowned slightly. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked carefully. The woman pointed to the monitor. "The rhythm is organized," she said, "but there's no pulse." One of the nurses checked the patient's neck again. Her expression changed. "There's no pulse," she confirmed. The woman nodded. "That's pulseless electrical activity," she said calmly. "The heart isn't pumping, even though the electrical system is still working." Dr. Harris stared at the monitor again. For the first time since the emergency began, doubt crossed his mind. Had they misread the rhythm? The woman continued speaking, her voice calm but urgent. "You need to stop shocking him," she said. "Start high-quality CPR and push epinephrine." The nurses exchanged uncertain glances. One of them whispered quietly to Dr. Harris, "Doctor, should we listen to her?" Dr. Harris hesitated. Every second mattered. And yet, the woman's explanation made perfect medical sense. Finally, he made a decision. "Stop the defibrillator," he said. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the doctor. "Continue CPR," he ordered. The nurse immediately resumed chest compressions. "Prepare epinephrine." The homeless woman stepped closer to the bed. "Slow the compressions slightly," she said. "They're too fast." The nurse adjusted her rhythm. The woman then leaned slightly toward the patient, watching the monitor carefully. "Check his airway again," she added. Another nurse quickly adjusted the oxygen mask. Dr. Harris couldn't take his eyes off the woman. Her movements were precise, efficient. There was no hesitation in her voice. This wasn't guesswork. This was someone who had done this many times before. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the monitor again. "Give the epinephrine now." The injection was administered. Seconds passed. The room filled with tension. Everyone watched the monitor. Then something changed. The chaotic pattern slowly began to stabilize. One of the nurses gasped. "Wait!" The line on the screen began to move differently. Dr. Harris quickly checked the patient's neck again. His fingers froze. "I feel something," he said quietly. The nurse looked at him in disbelief. "You mean—" "Yes," Dr. Harris whispered. "There's a pulse." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was completely silent. The patient's heart had started beating again, and every single person in that room knew one thing. If that woman hadn't spoken, the patient would already be dead. For a few moments, the entire emergency room stood completely still. The steady rhythm on the heart monitor filled the silence. Beep, beep, beep. The patient's heart was beating again, slowly but steadily. Dr. Harris took a step back and let out a deep breath. "We have a pulse," he said. The nurses looked at each other in disbelief. Just minutes ago, they had been preparing to pronounce the patient dead. And now, his heart was beating again. One of the nurses turned toward the woman. Her eyes were wide with amazement. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. The woman didn't answer right away. She was still watching the patient carefully. After a moment, she stepped back from the bed. "He should stabilize now," she said calmly. "Keep monitoring his oxygen and blood pressure." Her voice sounded exactly like that of an experienced medical professional giving instructions. Dr. Harris slowly removed his gloves. Then he looked directly at her. "You still haven't answered my question," he said. "Who are you?" For the first time since entering the room, the woman hesitated. Her eyes moved across the room, the bright lights, the equipment, the familiar sounds of the emergency department. For a moment, it looked as if she had traveled many years back in time. Finally, she spoke. "I used to work in emergency services," she said quietly. The nurses exchanged surprised glances. Dr. Harris crossed his arms. "You mean, as a paramedic?" The woman nodded slightly. "Yes." The room fell silent again. It suddenly explained everything. The way she understood the monitor, The way she gave instructions, the calm confidence in her voice. Dr. Harris studied her face carefully. "If you were a paramedic," he said slowly, "why are you living on the street?" The question hung in the air. For several seconds, the woman said nothing. Then she looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "one bad night can destroy everything." No one interrupted her. She continued speaking slowly. "3 years ago, I was working night shifts on an ambulance." Her eyes seemed distant now, as if she were watching memories unfold in front of her. "There was a highway accident," she said. "A family car hit a truck." The room grew very quiet. "There was a little boy in the back seat," she continued. "He wasn't breathing." The nurses listened silently. "I tried everything," she said. "CPR, oxygen, medication." Her voice trembled slightly. "But we couldn't save him." Dr. Harris watched her carefully. "That must have been difficult," he said quietly. The woman nodded. "It wasn't just that," she whispered. She took a slow breath. "The boy's father blamed me." Her hands tightened slightly. "He said I didn't act fast enough." The room remained silent. "And after that," she continued, "everything in my life started falling apart." The room remained silent. Everyone in the emergency department could feel the weight of her words. Sometimes, one bad night can destroy everything. Dr. Harris looked at the woman differently now. Just minutes ago, she had seemed like a stranger who had somehow wandered into the hospital. But now, she was clearly someone who once belonged here, someone who had stood in rooms like this many times before, someone who had fought for lives. "Did they fire you?" one of the nurses asked gently. The woman shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I left." Dr. Harris frowned slightly. "You left because of that accident?" She nodded slowly. "At first I thought I could keep working," she said. "But every call, every ambulance ride, every patient—" Her voice grew softer. "I kept seeing that boy." The nurses exchanged sad glances. "That happens to many of us," Dr. Harris said carefully. "But most people eventually learn how to live with it." The woman looked at him. Her eyes were tired, but calm. "I thought I would too," she said. "But things got worse." She took a slow breath. "I stopped sleeping. Then I stopped going to work. And after that, everything else followed." She looked down again. "I lost my job, my apartment, my friends." Her voice was steady now, almost emotionless. Eventually, there was nothing left. The room remained silent. Dr. Harris slowly leaned against the counter. "Why come back tonight?" he asked. The woman looked at the patient lying on the bed, the man whose life she had just saved. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she spoke. "I didn't come back," she said. "I was just walking past the hospital." Everyone looked surprised. "It was cold outside," she continued, "and I saw the ambulance arrive." Her voice grew quieter. I heard the panic in the paramedic's voice. She paused. "And something inside me reacted before I could think." Dr. Harris looked at the patient monitor again. The heart rhythm was now stable, strong, regular. "You saved his life," he said. The woman shook her head. "No," she replied softly. "You were already trying to save him. I just helped." The nurse standing near the bed suddenly looked at the patient chart. Her eyes widened. "Doctor." Dr. Harris turned. "What is it?" She pointed to the name on the chart. Dr. Harris read it. And then he froze. For several seconds he said nothing. The woman noticed the change in his expression. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Dr. Harris slowly looked up at her. "You said the accident happened 3 years ago," he said. "Yes." And the boy? She nodded slightly. Yes. Dr. Harris turned the chart so she could see it. The name of the patient was written clearly. Her hands began to tremble, because the last name was the same last name as the father she had spoken about, the father who had blamed her, the father who had shouted that night, the man lying on the hospital bed, was the same man, the boy's father. The woman stared at the chart in disbelief, her lips parted slightly. I didn't know, she whispered. Dr. Harris looked at the patient again. Life sometimes moved in strange circles. 3 years ago, this woman had tried to save a boy. Tonight, she had saved the boy's father. The room was silent again. One of the nurses wiped a tear from her eye. Does he know? She asked quietly. Dr. Harris shook his head. He's still unconscious. The woman slowly stepped back. I should go, she said softly. But Dr. Harris stopped her. Wait. She looked at him. You said you lost everything, he said. She nodded. He thought for a moment. Then he spoke. Our emergency department is short-staffed. The nurses looked at him in surprise. We need experienced people, he continued. And from what I just saw, he gave a small smile. You haven't forgotten how to save lives. The woman stared at him. She clearly hadn't expected those words. I don't even have a place to live, she said quietly. That can be solved, Dr. Harris replied. The nurses around the room began nodding. One of them smiled. You belong here, she said. For the first time that night, the woman's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Sometimes one terrible night can destroy a life, but sometimes one unexpected moment can begin to rebuild it again. If you appreciate powerful stories like this and enjoy meaningful content that touches the heart, please support the channel, leave a like, subscribe, and write a comment below. Your support truly helps our channel grow and allows us to continue sharing stories like this with the world. Thank you for listening.